Mark and Jennair Gerardot were a happily married couple, content with their careers, golden retrievers, and each other. But then, Mark gets a new career opportunity in another state, an opportunity that would ultimately lead to an extramarital affair. And what Jennair did after she learned the truth would shatter their lives forever. Hello and welcome to The Dark Side of Love. I'm your host, Bianca Sloan, author of suspense novels about the dark side of love. And this week I'm putting a spotlight on the case I'm calling What a Scorned Wife Will Do. The love story of Mark Gerardot and Jennair Cox starts as so many love stories do, over food. In their case, fast food. The year was 1986, summertime in Fort Wayne, Indiana. Mark and his friend Rick popped into Taco Bell, as one does, and standing behind the counter was a beautiful girl with curly blonde hair and blue eyes framed by long lashes. As Mark described in his book Irreparable, he was mesmerized by this girl, thinking to himself, quote, "It's not just anyone who could make a brown polyester Taco Bell uniform look that good." Mark says he was so tongue-tied he couldn't do anything but stare, while Rick, his friend who he was with, stepped in and flirted with the pretty girl with the pretty and unusual name of Jennair. Mark noted in his book that while he didn't get the girl that day, he would see her over the years at random football and basketball games when their respective high schools played each other, as well as the choir competitions they both participated in. According to Mark, he was too shy to ever get up the nerve to approach the vivacious and outspoken Jennair, certain that even if he did, she wouldn't remember him. And then one day in 1990, fate stepped in again, when Mark took his Pontiac Firebird into the shop for a new battery. And sitting there in a brown leather bomber jacket and all that frizzy blonde hair was none other than Jennair. Mark says that after stealing glances at each other, she asked if he was a Gerardot. He asked if she was Jennair. A simple exchange that ignited a 28-year relationship. A self-described dork, Mark says he didn't think he was in Jennair's league because she was a hot girl who was super cool. Mark says he was a, quote, kid from the sticks who went to high school in a cornfield, and that as a straight-A student, he hadn't even ever missed a day of school. As the 10th of 11 children, Mark's overprotective parents imposed a strict curfew and rarely allowed participation in activities like parties or school dances. As a result of all this sheltered existence, Mark was a seriously naive guy who was taught that sex was disgusting and that he and his brothers and sisters were conceived by immaculate conception. No, he really does say that this is what he believed. Catholic schoolgirl Jennair, on the other hand, possessed a fiery independent streak and thrived on breaking the rules. A cheerleader who ate her lunch in the library and went to Kiss concerts. Mark found himself overwhelmingly attracted to this Give Zero S rebel, this brutally honest, too cool for school chick, his opposite in so many ways. And as he says, he was hooked. As college students, a private Catholic university for Mark and Indiana University Fort Wayne for Jennair, the romance bloomed, with the more sexually experienced Jennair guiding the more unseasoned Mark toward developing a healthy sexual relationship. In the process, undoing a lot of the puritanical ideas about sex his parents had instilled in him. While Jennair presented as this badass free spirit with an independent streak, Mark admits in his book that at times, that energy could be intense. While her, quote, off-putting and direct nature was part of the attraction for Mark, he says that boldness could sometimes rub other people the wrong way. As a result, according to Mark, she didn't exactly fit in with his friends. And speaking of friends, Mark describes an incident where one of Jennair's best friends uninvited her from a planned vacation. The friendship between the two girls ended, and according to Mark, after that, Jennair never really engaged very much with any of her girlfriends. While Mark was totally gaga about Jennair, he was also young and not really hearing any wedding bells. In addition, because he was someone with limited dating experience, understandably there was a part of him that wanted to spread his wings a little, particularly after he met a fellow student that he wanted to date. After breaking things off with Jennair, he pursued his new lady love only for her to ghost him months later, which left him free once again for Jennair. A chance run-in with his ex at the mall convinced Mark he was an idiot and that he had to win her back. So he did. Following his graduation from college, Mark and Jennair maintained a long-distance relationship, though after a while it began to wear on the young couple. Jennair's solution was to break up. Mark's was to propose. According to Mark, the newly engaged couple received a tepid response to their engagement, and he himself started to have some doubts, sharing with a friend that Jennair could be exacting, criticizing everything from the way he drove to the way he dressed. In fact, Mark says his friends expressed to him that they thought Jennair was a control freak. She was the one who decided who Mark hung out with and when. When he got ready in the morning to go to work, she insisted that he get dressed in the dark because she was still sleeping. Coming from a large family with overbearing parents, Mark admits Jennair's demands, her dictating of his life, felt natural to him. It's what he was used to. He acknowledges that he blew off the red flags that his friends waved in his face about his bride-to-be, rationalizing that people just didn't get them as a couple. And besides, he was so in love with her, and they had all their inside jokes, and as he put it, their bizarre sense of humor that they shared, that in his mind, they were a perfect match. And so, on October 23rd, 1993, 25-year-old Mark and 23-year-old Jennair tied the knot, promising to love each other until death did them part. The couple settled in Indianapolis, where Mark had secured a job as a graphic designer. In the early days of their marriage, Mark describes how tight finances led the couple to spending nearly all of their time together because they couldn't afford to do anything. So dinners out, movies, plays didn't happen. And instead, they spent all of their spare time at their neighborhood bookstore, endlessly browsing books and magazines while nursing cups of coffee. According to Mark, it was just the two of them cocooned together in their own little world. Occasionally, Mark did want to come up for air, such as when his friends wanted to come over or even to hang out with just him. However, Jennair was not down with that. He says that when he tried to get her to make friends outside of the marriage, she didn't want to do that either. She wanted all of her time to be Mark's time, and all of Mark's time to be her time. Mark says she thought that something was wrong with him, that he wanted to hang out with his buddies or do anything without her. "I don't have time for friends," would be her response whenever he would encourage her to cultivate friends and interests outside of him. According to him, she would also say, quote, "I just want to spend time with you. Why can't it just be us?" Again, Mark admits this felt kind of natural to him and in a way kind of flattering. Because, of course, if somebody wants to be with you all the time, you like that, right? We all want that. And because his own parents had smothered him and his siblings, to him, with no other points of reference, he thought, well, this is just how marriage is. Eventually, Mark's friends, or rather the time that Mark wanted to spend with his friends, became a sticking point in the marriage. As in, the couple argued about it to the point that Mark, in his words, just succumbed and let Jennair have her way. He says cutting off his friends in exchange for keeping his wife happy felt like a small price to pay. Early in the marriage, a seemingly innocuous act on Mark's part and Jennair's reaction would set the tone for their relationship for years to come, and frankly serve as a big-ass red flag that you don't realize until it's too late what a big-ass red flag it is. Apparently, Jennair was what my father would call a pack rat, but let's keep it real, she was a hoarder. Holding on to old magazines and catalogs for years, empty wine bottles, boxes inside of boxes, knickknacks, you name it. Anyway, it started with these magazines that were stacked everywhere. So Mark, thinking he was being an industrious husband, took it upon himself one night while she was at work to clear out the clutter, toss those yellowing old magazines into the dumpster, make space for new things. He thought his wife would be proud, thrilled even, with his proactiveness. No, that's just not at all what happened. Jennair came home and found these precious magazines gone and went fakakta. As Mark put it, screaming, raging meltdown. And then she spent 3 hours knee-deep in the dumpster, pawing through the garbage to save these old magazines, which are now covered in who knows what, and marched them back into their apartment where she would keep them for years to come. Through the years, Mark says he would try to talk to her about this obsessive attachment to stuff, but like so many things, it would ignite a firestorm. And as he told 2020, arguing with Jennair was pointless because, quote, she was always going to have the last word. My boyfriend says that to me sometimes. I wonder if I should worry about that. Anyway, for Mark, the positives of being married to Jennair far outweighed the negatives, and the couple put all of their energies into furthering their careers, eventually buying their first home and doing all of the renovations themselves. Kids was something they talked about, and Mark says it was a step he assumed was somewhere over the horizon. However, life kept getting in the way, and as Mark says, he sensed a, quote, uneasiness with her where kids were concerned. It wasn't something they talked about, but there seemed to have been an unspoken agreement between them that there would be no children. And instead, they, like so many people, turned all of their love and attention to their golden retriever, Mesa. Well, if Jennair just wants to spend all of her time with Mark, I don't imagine that she wanted kids getting in the way of that. Just reading between the lines. For the next few years, Mark and Jennair presented as the American dream. Good jobs, nice house, dog, romantic vacations. They'd skyrocketed past their humble blue-collar roots to a life of escalating prosperity. Everything was perfect. Except we all know perfection, when it exists, doesn't last forever. The bubble burst when Jennair lost her job as a marketing coordinator for a real estate company. Mark, who'd started a successful design firm by this point, decided to bring Jennair on board. Bad decision. In a trend that Mark had already seen with how she didn't interact with his friends, Jennair rubbed Mark's team the wrong way. As in, his employees eventually gave him a her or us ultimatum, which of course rubbed Mark the wrong way. Everybody's being rubbed the wrong way. Of course, because Jennair was the boss's wife, she stayed. Though Mark did lose other employees, he soldiered on, and it seemed that the crisis had been averted. Which meant another one was looming on the horizon. In 2005, the couple decided to trade up from their starter home and moved into a swanky new house in Carmel, the wealthiest city in Indiana. Mark admits they were in over their heads, that the luxurious 2-story, 4-bedroom house with its formal dining room and cathedral ceilings was really too much for just the two of them. And we know they're not entertaining, so it's just the two of them literally in that house. And they really weren't able to keep up with the Joneses that they now lived next door to. And while it was fun to do all of the renovations themselves on their first house, which was a starter home, it wasn't so cute when all of their wealthy neighbors were hiring out contractors while the two of them are over there running their own electrical. But they made it work, and the end result was a beautiful, top-of-the-line home. Then, 2008, aka the financial crisis, hit and brought the world crashing down onto their heads. The business went bust, the house went bye-bye, and by 2011, Mark and Jennair were ready for a fresh start. They chose Greenville, South Carolina for their new beginning, where they'd both secured new jobs in marketing. In the beginning, the change seemed to do the couple good, as they reconnected with each other and explored their new home state, their spare time used to hike in the mountains and lounge on the beautiful sandy beaches. However, in 2017, fate shook up the snow globe yet again, when Jennair was let go from another job. She wasn't having much luck finding a new one, and as Mark shared with 2020, her self-esteem started to take a hit. As they'd done before when they moved to South Carolina, fate seemed to be pointing them towards making yet another fresh start in a new place. The hunt for a new job in another state began, and it was during that search that Mark came across a listing for a creative director in the marketing department at the University of Delaware. Interested, he sent an email to the person listed as the supervisor for the position. Her name was Meredith Chapman. Though Meredith was young, she was seriously accomplished. Petite with chestnut brown hair, Meredith had started her career as a local news reporter and producer, eventually segueing into politics, taking on the role of communications manager in the House of Representatives for then Delaware Congressman Mike Castle. Meredith took that interest in politics all the way to a run for Delaware State Senate in 2016, coming within 5 points of defeating the incumbent, David Sokola. However, Meredith, who'd earned both her bachelor's and master's degrees from the University of Delaware, maintained close ties to the school, holding positions of increasing responsibility in the Office of Communication and Marketing, rising through the ranks to become a senior marketing director. In addition, she had adjunct positions in both the Department of Communication and the Lerner College of Business and Economics. She created award-winning marketing campaigns, was a member of the inaugural class of the Delaware Business Times 40 Under 40, and a 2015 Fellow of Leadership Delaware. Words that have been used to describe Meredith include vibrant, intelligent, passionate, sharp, and hardworking. All of these qualities and more drew Mark to Meredith when they met about the vacant position. Mark told 2020 that he knew inside of 5 minutes that despite her being 15 years younger than he was, he had to work for this woman, saying, quote, "She was so articulate and so energetic and passionate about the job and accomplished at her age to be in the position she was in. I was dumbfounded." Mark got the job, and in November 2017, he left Jennair behind in South Carolina to close up shop while he headed north to Delaware. Not only would this new job have the distinction of marking a turning point in his career, it would also sound the death knell for his marriage. Mark lived alone in Delaware for about a month and a half as Jennair wrapped up their life in South Carolina, which meant he had a lot of time on his hands to get to know his new colleagues. And specifically, he had a lot of time to get to know Meredith. Things began innocently enough, as they do in situations like this. Mark and Meredith started their working relationship, and over time, they learned that personally, they had a lot in common. And then, Meredith invited Mark out for a drink. Mark told 2020 it was easy for him to talk to her, that he was able to share things with her about his family and even his marriage, though he says, quote, "not necessarily in a negative way." The feelings Mark says he was having for Meredith were both confusing and amazing. The more time he says they spent together, the more he realized that the things he had taken as the gospel in his marriage suddenly started to look a whole lot different. While Jennair constantly criticized everything from Mark's leadership style, his organizational or lack thereof skills, his attention span, Meredith emboldened Mark, highlighting his strengths, his good qualities, his standout characteristics. It was a narrative he had never heard from his wife, and one that flipped a switch in Mark. As he shared with 2020, quote, "That just made an impression on me. Here's this woman who I think is amazing saying she thinks I'm a wonderful man." Mark says Meredith made him feel inspired and empowered, neither of which he'd felt in all the years he'd been married to Jennair. Surprise, surprise, the situation between Mark and Meredith escalated over the ensuing weeks to kissing. However, a guilt-ridden Mark says he wasn't ready to take that next step with Meredith, who had shared with him that she, too, was in an unraveling marriage to former Newark City Councilman Luke Chapman. Despite everything he was feeling, despite all signs to go for it, Mark says he just wasn't ready to walk away from Jennair. Difficult as he says she was, there was a long and intimate history there, and he was still dedicated to the marriage. Still, Mark says he was, quote, enthralled by this connection he shared with Meredith, and he wasn't ready to let it go without at least exploring it. I don't know, you're in a bad marriage, just cut the cord, walk away. This is not cool. Not cool. During that month and a half that Mark lived alone in Delaware, he and Meredith were now saying, "I love you." By the time Jennair arrived in Delaware, she knew something was not right in her marriage, and she rightly suspected that Meredith was that something. Even though Mark denied that there was anything going on with his boss, Mark states in his book he and Meredith hadn't yet slept together, so I guess this was an emotional affair, which sometimes, frankly, is worse. But Jennair, as you can imagine, was not about to let this go. Unbeknownst to Mark, his wife hired a company that granted her access to his phone, which meant she could read his text messages, look at his photos, and see all the times he had talked to Meredith. So at this point, Mark's busted. Still, he and Jennair decided to see a marriage counselor. And it was as he was getting ready for their second session, Mark learned that Jennair, like so many things over the years, was not ready to give up her control. As he shared with 2020, as he put on his coat that day, he discovered something bulging in the lining. Turns out, it was a recording device. Mark says that when he confronted Jennair about it, she confessed that yes, she had sewn the device into his jacket because she wanted greater insight into the extent of the relationship with Meredith. With this revelation, the marriage, already on the skids, goes into freefall. Mark, by now deeply in love with Meredith, decides he's done. He's exhausted from dealing with Jennair's viciousness, of the lying, the sneaking around, and according to 2020, Mark told his wife that as soon as he met the residency requirements for Delaware, he was piecing out of the marriage and filing for divorce. Turns out Meredith was also making some exit plans, cutting the cord on her 9-year marriage ahead of a move to Radnor, Pennsylvania to take a job with Villanova University. Despite the upheaval, Mark and Meredith continued their relationship. As her marriage disintegrated, Jennair, predictably, was coming apart at the seams. She began to see a divorce coach who shared with 2020 that Jennair expressed a tremendous amount of rage over having been, quote, tossed away and traded in for the 15 years younger Meredith. Mark says she even threatened to jump out of a window. In one of the conversations she recorded of Mark, Jennair acknowledges his relationship with Meredith is something, quote, fresh and different, saying, quote, she lights your fire. She makes you feel young. Jennair also concludes to her husband, quote, you don't find me attractive. You don't want me anymore. You don't even like me. I have to imagine, too, that Jennair, who'd been struggling in her career, might have felt some professional resentment towards Meredith because they're in the same industry. So Meredith, by all accounts, was a superstar in the marketing and communications field, rising, all the way to a VP job at Villanova. That's pretty prestigious. Jennair, on the other hand, has been laid off from 2 marketing jobs, had her husband's employees revolt against her, and now couldn't find a new gig. On top of that, she's in a new city, she doesn't know anyone, so there's no support system, and your husband has left you for this much younger dynamo? I mean, that's a lot. That's a lot. All by this point, fair to say, Jennair was unspooling in pretty spectacular fashion. Still, Mark says that he was determined to do what he could to help his wife cope with the divorce. He even agreed to a list of requests that she had before they officially separated and he moved out. Things that they could do together, like going out to dinner and going hiking together. While Mark says he found the whole thing to be a little weird, he was still dedicated to doing whatever he had to help Jennair transition to life post-marriage, post-divorce. So he agreed. And even though she'd have crying jags, according to Mark, overall she was, quote, acting normal. Except what Jennair was really up to was anything but normal. April 23rd, 2018. As Mark writes in his book, that morning, as he prepared to leave for work, he turned to Jennair and said, I love you. Despite being in the throes of a divorce and on the cusp of moving out, of starting a life that didn't include her, Mark says he wanted his wife to know that indeed he did still love her. I mean, that is not the look that you think it is, because all you're hearing is, you love me, but you don't want to be with me. So, yeah, don't do that, people. Just don't do it. The couple had agreed to meet that night in Newtown Square in Philadelphia for a quiet dinner to hash out some of the issues around their divorce. Mark says that typically his declarations of love, even in the midst of this messy break between them, would bring tears to Jennair's eyes. But on this particular morning, she had no response but just to stare back at him, her face blank. Mark dropped the coffee off to Meredith, where they exchanged I love yous and shared a hug and a long kiss. Throughout the day, Mark and Meredith exchanged selfies, text messages, and updated their shared Google Calendar with important dates. As the day wound down, Mark headed to the restaurant where he and Jennair had planned to meet for dinner. As he waited for her, they exchanged perfunctory text messages regarding the logistics of where Mark was sitting, and his offer of a glass of Cabernet for Jennair, who was running late because she'd made a wrong turn. At 6 p.m., he got a panicked text message from Jennair wanting to know where their dog Huck was. with a subsequent text accusing Mark of taking him, and Mark instructing her to look again. At 6:05, Jennair has located the dog, but claims she's now too upset and is turning around to go home, demanding that Mark leave the restaurant and also go home. Mark, who has already ordered dinner, tells her he's staying. 5 minutes later, 6:10, Mark's phone sounds with an incoming message from Jennair. It's a picture of a used condom on top of a small pile of trash, with an accompanying text message, quote, "You fucked her." Mark denies it. Then Jennair sends a succession of 3 text messages within a 5-minute span. "You ruined my life. I hope you never find happiness. Bye, Mark." As Mark writes in his book, initially he was confused by this bizarre text exchange. Then he got angry because Jennair was rummaging through Meredith's trash. Mark immediately starts to text Meredith, but she doesn't answer. He says it finally dawns on him that Jennair has found out where Meredith lives and is going through her garbage. His only logical conclusion is that his wife is, quote, "out of control." Understandably, he starts to panic, imagining the kraken Jennair has likely unleashed on Meredith. 25 years of being on the receiving end of those vitriolic rages flashing through Mark's mind as he imagines all the things that Jennair could be spewing at Meredith. He has to get to Meredith. He has to stop Jennair from exploding. In the midst of this, his mother-in-law and sister-in-law are calling him, but he lets the calls go to voicemail. All he can think about is getting to Meredith. He races to her house. Her car is parked in the driveway. He knocks on the door. No answer. He walks around to the back of the house and knocks on the glass-paneled door. Again, no answer. He peeks inside and sees Meredith laying face down on the floor between the kitchen and the dining room. Her keys are in one hand, phone in the other. Mark pounds on the glass, screaming her name. No answer. The door is unlocked, and Mark rushes inside, still calling Meredith's name. He notices blood on her calf and on the wall above her. He runs outside, intent on getting help from Meredith's neighbor Tim, who's actually standing on his porch. Mark screams for him to call 911. Tim rushes into the house, dispatch on the other end of the phone. They're instructed to check for a pulse. There isn't one. Mark drops to his knees and touches her back. She's warm. Dispatch tells them to get out of the house. The police are on the way. Mark writes that he can't do it. He can't leave Meredith. He realizes there's a pool of blood around her head. 911 tells them again, get out of the house. Reluctantly, Mark stands up, prepared to comply. And that's when he sees Jennair. His wife, like Meredith, is laying face down on the floor. She's dressed in a black hoodie and black jogging pants, black Nike running shoes on her feet. It hits Mark, finally, what's happening. And according to what he writes in his book, about all he can remember is letting loose a repeated string of profanities as the situation comes into stunning focus. Police and EMTs flood Meredith's backyard, and amidst the chaos, he says all he can think is save them. But it's too late. Meredith and Jennair are both dead. Meredith Chapman was 33 years old. Jennair Gerardot was 47 years old. As part of the moneyed Philadelphia mainline suburbs, murder-suicides don't happen in this leafy enclave of Radnor, so of course, tongues were a-wagging as residents whispered amongst themselves about the sordid events of April 23rd, wondering what had happened. Mark initially, of course, a suspect in the killings, asked himself the same thing. On the surface, Meredith's murder and Jennair's suicide would appear to be an impulsive, heat-of-the-moment crime of passion. Well, as Mark would soon discover, Jennair hadn't left anything to chance. The first thing he learned was that, according to witnesses, in the days before the shootings, a woman, which we now know was Jennair, had been skulking around Meredith's house in a trench coat, hat, sunglasses, wig, and binoculars because, of course, binoculars. Jennair had also rented a Cadillac 2 weeks beforehand and had even parked it outside of her and Mark's apartment, and Mark had no idea. Police later found her surveillance outfit in this rented Cadillac. Police believe Jennair had scoped out Meredith's house ahead of time and on the evening of the shootings broke in sometime that afternoon and waited, careful to clean up the shards of glass afterwards so that Meredith wouldn't immediately see it and call the cops to report a break-in. Once Meredith was inside, it was too late. Jennair pounced on her as soon as she came through the door, shooting her once in the head before turning the gun on herself. William Colarulo, superintendent of the Radnor Township Police, said in a press conference at the time that, quote, "This was a calculated and planned attack." Learning these things sent Mark hurtling down a rabbit hole as he decided to find out what else his wife had been hiding from him. Scouring her bank records, credit card statements, and computer revealed that there were 2 Jennairs. The one who pretended like she was totally going along with the divorce, and the other who was determined to exact a bloody and chilling revenge on the 2 people she blamed for destroying her life. Mark told 2020 following his admission of the affair, Jennair opened up secret bank accounts and credit cards in order to buy surveillance equipment, including high-tech GPS tracking systems that she affixed to both his and Meredith's cars, a lock-picking kit, computer hacking software, and get this, DNA testing kits for his clothes. He also discovered she was taking pictures of all of his private exchanges with Meredith, from text messages to Snapchats, over 400 by his estimate. He thinks that she gained access to his phone by waiting until he'd fallen asleep, then pressing his thumb against the reader while he slept. On March 18th, 5 weeks before the shootings, Jennair purchased the gun she would use, and as Mark told 2020, the credit card statements indicated she went to the firing range 3 times to practice shooting. Jennair also spent her time listening to every word that Mark was saying. He shared with 2020 that Jennair had planted multiple listening devices in his clothes, not just the one he found in his coat that one time. She spent untold amounts of time and energy constantly removing devices, sewing new ones into the lining of all of his jackets. Weeks and weeks of put one in, take it out, replace it with another one, lather, rinse, and repeat. And then, there were the transcripts. Mark told 2020 he discovered computer files with hours and hours and hours of audio of his conversations. And she transcribed them into a notebook by hand. I mean, where on earth do you find the time or the interest in that? I mean, this was her full-time job. Clearly, Jennair was a woman consumed, possessed. In one final coda, Mark told 2020 he learned that on the night Jennair shot herself and Meredith, she sent an email to her family detailing exactly what she planned to do and why. And these weren't simple emails either, because I think we see nothing about Jennair was simple. She had started the emails weeks ahead of time, meticulously dating the entries and full-on admitting that what she was about to do was payback. You want her instead of me? Well, guess what? You can't have her. However, according to People magazine, Mark described in an interview with Dr. Oz that Jennair had a plan B, one in which that if she had to, she'd take him out. As Mark says, according to a 15-page letter he found, Jennair had described in great detail exactly what was going down, saying, quote, she, meaning Jennair, was afraid of me walking in first, and that if he does, I'm going to have to do a Bren Phil Hartman, an apparent reference to the brutal murder of the Saturday Night Live star whose wife, Bren, shot him as he slept before shooting herself. Mark told 2020 that in spite of the violent way their marriage ended, he still loves Jennair, saying, quote, I broke her heart, and more than anything, out of all of this, my regret comes back to breaking her heart and making her feel like she had no other choice. I wish I wouldn't have hurt her because I loved her. I still love her. I wish I could take it back. If you or someone you know is having suicidal thoughts, please call the National Suicide Prevention Lifeline 24 hours a day at 800-273-8255. Thank you so much for joining me for another episode of The Dark Side of Love. I'm your host, Bianca Sloan, and show your love for The Dark Side of Love by visiting thedarksideoflove.com for show notes and transcripts. Also, while you're there, you can find a link to my Patreon page where you can access bonus episodes and other fun stuff. Learn more about my suspense novels about the dark side of love by visiting biancasloan.com. Thanks for hanging out with me, and join me next time for another tale of love gone wrong. I'll see you on the dark side.